cold billionaire husband drew the line, but watching her walk away destroyed him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The night Ethan Cross drew the line, the city below his penthouse glowed like a controlled burn, quiet and distant, 20 stories down, traffic moving like veins of light along Fifth Avenue. He stood with his back to the room, suit jacket still on, cufflinks unfastened but untouched, as if even the idea of comfort needed approval. Behind him, Lena Moore waited without speaking. The marble floor was cold through the soles of her flats, and the thermostat read 72, but the room felt colder, the kind of cold that comes from rules being spoken aloud. Ethan did not turn around when he said it. This marriage works only if you do not cross the line. His voice was calm, practiced, the same tone he used with boards and banks and lawyers who feared wasting his time. He believed clarity prevented chaos. He believed lines kept people safe. Lena nodded once, slowly, because she understood contracts, and because she had learned that interrupting men like Ethan only made them repeat themselves louder. She had signed the agreement 3 months earlier at a conference table longer than her childhood apartment, a document measured in inches and margins, promising discretion, appearances, and silence. No love, no interference, no expectations. She agreed because she needed a clean exit from a life that had taught her how expensive mistakes could be, and because Ethan needed a wife who would not ask questions. They lived together with the efficiency of strangers sharing a schedule. Breakfast at 7:30, black coffee for him, toast she barely touched. Evenings split by calendars, meetings, and flights measured in miles she never traveled. Ethan returned late, often after midnight, the scent of cold air and leather following him inside. Lena left a lamp on by the sofa, so the room would not greet him with darkness. He never noticed, not because he was cruel, but because noticing meant acknowledging something unaccounted for. That night, after he drew the line, Lena folded her coat over her arm. She had planned to stay quiet, to keep the peace the way she always did, but something in his certainty pressed against her ribs. She realized the line was not protecting him. It was protecting the version of him that never had to risk being known. She said nothing dramatic. She did not argue. She simply said she understood, and the words sounded heavier than it should have. Ethan exhaled, satisfied, believing order had been restored. He thought boundaries ended discomfort. He did not see the way Lena's gaze moved across the room, memorizing the angles, the art he never explained, the window that faced east where the sun rose in winter. He did not hear the small decisions settle inside her, quiet as snow. Minutes later, the elevator doors closed around her reflection, and the penthouse returned to its usual silence. Ethan stood alone, watching the city burn steadily, convinced he had done the responsible thing, unaware that the line he drew had just begun to erase him. The agreement Lena signed 3 months earlier had been printed on thick ivory paper, the kind that did not wrinkle easily, the kind meant to feel permanent the moment your fingers touched it. She remembered the weight of the pen more than the words, how it pressed into her hand, as if asking her to commit to something heavier than ink. Ethan Cross had been sitting across from her then, calm, composed, already married in his mind to the outcome rather than the woman. He had explained the arrangement with the same precision he used when discussing mergers measured in billions of dollars. A strategic marriage. Temporary. Necessary. Clean. No emotions. No disruption. No expectations. Lena had listened without interrupting, because she understood something Ethan did not. Silence, when chosen freely, was power. She agreed not because the money impressed her, or because the penthouse promised safety, but because she needed distance from a past that kept pulling at her ankles. She had learned early that survival sometimes required stepping into someone else's structure until you could rebuild your own. From the outside, the marriage looked effortless. Photographs captured them standing close, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his smile polite and distant. Investors relaxed. Rumors faded. The board approved his leadership without resistance. Ethan considered the arrangement a success because nothing unexpected happened. He did not notice the effort it took for Lena to remain invisible. She learned the rhythms of the penthouse the way one learns a foreign city, counting steps from the bedroom to the kitchen, memorizing which floorboard creaked near the study, adjusting her movements so she never startled him. She declined invitations that conflicted with his schedule, quietly managing public appearances, smoothing conversations with donors who asked questions he never heard. When an article threatened to speculate about his personal life, she contacted the editor herself, framing the response as loyalty rather than defense. Ethan never asked how it was handled. He only saw the problem disappear. At night, when he returned after midnight flights measured in hundreds of miles and deals closed in quiet conference rooms, the living room lamp was always on. Not bright, just enough to soften the darkness. Lena told herself it was practical, that a lit room made the space feel lived in, but the truth sat closer to her chest. She wanted him to come home to something waiting. Ethan stepped past the light each time without comment, hanging his coat with mechanical care, already thinking ahead to the next day. She watched him from the sofa, legs tucked beneath her, listening to the sound of his shoes crossing marble, and wondered if he ever noticed how quiet success could feel. The night he drew the line, something shifted inside her with unsettling clarity. When he said the marriage only worked if she did not cross it, Lena realized the line had always been there, invisible but firm, running through every interaction, every unasked question. She had been walking beside it carefully, believing respect meant restraint. But standing in that cold room, she understood that restraint had turned her into a ghost. Ethan believed he was protecting the balance. Lena saw that balance required her to keep shrinking. She packed slowly, choosing only what fit into one suitcase, leaving behind dresses selected for galas and shoes that echoed too loudly in hallways she no longer wished to cross. As she zipped the case closed, she paused, looking once more at the penthouse windows, the city glowing steady and distant. She wondered if Ethan would notice when the light was no longer on. Down in the elevator, the doors closed with a soft sound that felt final. Ethan remained upstairs, convinced order had been restored, unaware that the quiet he valued was about to deepen into absence, and that the woman who never crossed his line had finally stepped beyond it, not in anger, but in resolve, leaving behind a silence he would not know how to negotiate. The days after Lena left settled into a rhythm that felt almost identical to before, which was why it took Ethan longer than it should have to realize something was wrong. The penthouse remained immaculate, the staff moved quietly, the calendar stayed full. Meetings stacked one after another, flights measured in thousands of miles blurred together, numbers rose and fell exactly as predicted. On paper, nothing had changed. That was what convinced him he had been right. He told himself the arrangement had simply reached its natural conclusion, that temporary structures were meant to dissolve without consequence. Yet each evening, when he returned home, something subtle resisted him. The living room greeted him with darkness. Not dramatic darkness, not a power outage, but the deliberate absence of a single lamp. He paused the first night, fingers still wrapped around his coat, scanning the space, as if expecting the light to appear on its own. It did not. He shrugged it off, blaming routine. On the second night, he reached for the switch himself, then stopped halfway, irritated by the unfamiliar impulse. He left the room dark. Sleep became inefficient. Ethan lay awake calculating margins and timelines, but his thoughts kept drifting to details he had never cataloged before. The sound of Lena's footsteps in the morning, light and careful. The way she positioned herself beside him in public, close enough to signal unity, distant enough to respect the line. He noticed the dining table felt larger, the silence stretching instead of resting. When Mrs. Hale mentioned that Lena had asked for her final belongings to be sent to a forwarding address, Ethan nodded without looking up. He did not ask where she had gone. Asking implied interest, and interest implied vulnerability. At work, a problem surfaced that should have been simple. An investor questioned the stability of his leadership, hinting that recent changes felt abrupt. Ethan prepared his response with precision, but the words sounded hollow when spoken aloud. He realized, with irritation, that Lena had once handled these conversations quietly, anticipating concerns before they reached him. The absence was not emotional yet. It was operational. That disturbed him more than it should have. One evening, as rain streaked down the windows in uneven lines, Ethan found the contract still lying on the desk, where Lena had left it, edges perfectly aligned. He had not touched it since she walked out. He picked it up now, scanning the clauses he knew by heart. No expectations. No interference. No love. The words felt different without her presence to absorb them. He remembered how calmly she had nodded when he drew the line, how she had not tried to negotiate. Control, he realized, only worked when someone agreed to stay within it. The thought unsettled him. Days later, he attended a charity gala alone. Cameras flashed, questions came, and for the first time, he felt exposed rather than powerful. Without Lena beside him, the space felt unbalanced, his answers sharper than necessary. On the drive home, the city lights blurred, and an unfamiliar pressure settled behind his ribs. He dismissed it as fatigue. Back at the penthouse, he stood in the living room longer than usual, coat still on, listening to the hum of the building, the distant sirens, the sound of his own breathing. He noticed the sofa cushion she favored remained slightly indented, the way absence sometimes leaves a shape. For the first time, Ethan wondered if the line he drew had not protected order at all, but merely postponed reckoning. He imagined Lena somewhere else, choosing a smaller space, a quieter life, and the image unsettled him more than any market downer ever had. He told himself it was temporary discomfort, a recalibration period. Yet as he finally turned off the lights and moved toward the bedroom, the darkness followed him more closely than before, and for the first time since the marriage began, Ethan Cross felt something dangerously close to uncertainty, a crack forming beneath the structure he had trusted, hinting that the silence he valued might soon demand an answer. If Ethan had looked closely during those weeks, he might have seen the evidence of Lena's presence everywhere, woven into the smooth functioning of his life, like a hidden current. It had been Lena who memorized the moods of donors and executives, who knew which names required respect and which required distance. She had learned the difference between influence and noise, choosing when to speak and when silence carried more weight. While Ethan closed deals in rooms lined with glass and steel, Lena answered calls that never reached him, redirecting concerns before they became threats. She framed loyalty as stability, smoothing fractures he never knew existed. When a junior board member hinted that Ethan seemed distracted, Lena hosted a private dinner instead of issuing a statement, seating people carefully, guiding conversation gently, allowing reassurance to bloom without confrontation. Ethan attended, unaware that the evening had been engineered for his benefit, believing goodwill simply followed competence. At home, her sacrifices were quieter. She adjusted her sleep to match his unpredictable schedule, waking when she heard the elevator hum, listening for his footsteps even when exhaustion pressed against her eyes. She kept her voice low, her movements measured, never demanding attention. The penthouse became a place of subtle care rather than ownership. She remembered his preferences without being asked, the temperature he liked at night, the way he preferred silence after long flights. She never asked about his childhood, though she sensed the outline of it in the way he flinched at emotional unpredictability. Instead, she respected the line, believing restraint was the highest form of love she was allowed to offer. The lamp by the sofa became her quiet ritual, switched on every night no matter how late he returned. She told herself it was practical, a safety measure in a large apartment, but in truth it was a signal, a promise that someone had anticipated his arrival. Ethan never acknowledged it, yet he had never once stumbled in the dark while Lena lived there. When she left, the ritual vanished with her, and only then did the absence begin to register. Ethan found himself pausing at the threshold of the living room, irritated by the need to adjust to shadows. He told himself efficiency required adaptation, not sentiment. Yet efficiency did not explain why the space felt wrong. One afternoon, sorting through correspondence, he discovered a handwritten note tucked between official documents, a brief message thanking him for supporting a local education initiative. The handwriting was Lena's. He did not remember approving the donation. He searched his email records and found nothing. She had handled it quietly, aligning the gesture with his public image without drawing attention to herself. The realization unsettled him. He began noticing similar gaps, moments where success lacked a clear origin. The machine he trusted so completely had been running on unseen care. The night he finally asked Mrs. Hale if Lena had mentioned returning, the older woman paused before answering, her expression composed but firm. "She loved you in the only way you allowed, sir," she said softly. Ethan dismissed the comment with a nod, but the words lingered, unwelcome and persistent. Love was not part of the agreement. Yet as days stretched on, he began to understand how thoroughly Lena had integrated herself into the background of his life, shaping outcomes without crossing the line. Her absence was not dramatic. It was destabilizing. The penthouse echoed differently, the air heavier, the silence no longer neutral. Ethan found himself replaying moments he had once considered insignificant. The way Lena watched him speak to others, attentive but distant. The way she stepped back so he could stand alone in the spotlight. He had mistaken her restraint for detachment. Now, the invisible sacrifices surfaced one by one, demanding recognition. And with each realization came an unfamiliar ache, not sharp enough to name, but persistent enough to suggest that what he had lost was not convenience or order, but something far more fragile, something he had never learned how to protect, leaving him unsettled and alert in a life that had once felt flawlessly contained. The revelation came to Ethan Cross not as an emotional confession, but as a document, which felt appropriate given how his life had always functioned. It was a forwarded email from an assistant he barely remembered hiring, buried beneath budget approvals and flight confirmations, marked delayed because it had been rerouted weeks earlier to an address Lena no longer used. The subject line referenced a leadership fellowship in San Francisco, a program designed to elevate emerging strategists, people who preferred influence to visibility. Ethan opened it absently, expecting nothing, and instead found Lena's name threaded through the correspondence. She had been invited, not as his wife, not as an accessory, but on her own merit. The offer included a stipend, relocation assistance, and a platform she had never mentioned wanting. What stopped his breath was the final reply, written in her careful, restrained tone. She declined, citing personal commitments and timing. No explanation, no resentment, just a quiet no. The date on the email sat 2 days before the night he drew the line. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the office suddenly too small, the glass walls reflecting a version of himself he did not recognize. She had chosen him. Not the marriage, not the money, but the fragile balance he demanded she protect. And he had responded by tightening the rules. Memory rearranged itself with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered that evening now, how Lena had seemed distracted, how she had asked him a simple question about his schedule, and then nodded, as if confirming something to herself. He had mistaken her restraint for compliance. In truth, she had already sacrificed something significant, something he never knew existed, to remain within his boundaries. The line he drew that night had not been a clarification. It had been a dismissal. Ethan closed the email and stared at the skyline, the city's geometry suddenly oppressive. Control had always been his refuge. As a child, unpredictability had arrived disguised as abandonment, his mother leaving without warning, his father responding with silence rather than grief. Ethan learned early that rules prevented loss. If everything was defined, nothing could disappear unexpectedly. He built his empire on that belief, measuring risk, eliminating variables, rewarding obedience. Lena had entered that structure quietly, adapting herself to its limitations, and he had never questioned how much it cost her. The thought unsettled him more deeply than any financial threat ever had. That evening, Ethan returned to the penthouse earlier than usual. The space greeted him with its familiar stillness, but now it felt accusatory rather than neutral. He walked through the room slowly, noticing details he had once dismissed as decorative. A throw blanket folded on the chair, chosen for warmth rather than design. A stack of mail sorted with meticulous care. These were not signs of occupation. They were signs of intention. He stopped by the desk where the contract had once rested and imagined Lena reading it again in her final hours there, deciding what parts of herself to take and what to leave behind. The realization pressed against his chest with increasing insistence. He had believed love was a liability, something that blurred judgment and weakened resolve. What he had not considered was that denying it entirely created a different kind of weakness, one that left him unprepared for absence. Ethan poured a drink he did not finish, and stood by the window, watching the lights flicker below. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Lena had not crossed his line because she wanted more, but because staying within it had begun to erase her. The understanding landed heavily, reshaping his certainty into something brittle. He had not protected himself. He had pushed away the only person who navigated his world without trying to own it. Somewhere beyond the glass and steel, Lena was building a life without rules he imposed, and the thought triggered an unfamiliar urgency. Ethan Cross, who had always believed timing was everything, began to sense that delay might cost him more than any concession ever could, setting the stage for a choice he had never planned to make. The moment Ethan finally saw Lena again was not dramatic in the way movies promised, which somehow made it worse. It happened on a quiet weekday morning in the lobby of the building where Cross Holdings maintained its private legal offices, a place designed for discretion rather than spectacle. Ethan had arrived early, intent on finalizing paperwork that would formally dissolve the arrangement they had once called a marriage, telling himself this was efficiency, not desperation. The elevator doors opened, and there she was, standing near the reception desk with a single folder tucked under her arm. She looked different, not transformed, but settled, as if gravity had finally adjusted around her. Her coat was simple, her hair pulled back, her posture calm. She was not bracing for impact. She was finished. For a second, Ethan considered stepping back into the elevator, preserving distance the way he always had, but his feet did not move. Lena noticed him at the same time, her expression shifting only slightly, a polite acknowledgement rather than surprise. They exchanged greetings that sounded professional, careful, as though rehearsed for a room that demanded composure. She explained she was there to sign the last documents required to separate their public records. No accusation. No hesitation. Ethan nodded, listening to her voice with an intensity that startled him. He realized he had never truly listened before, always filtering her words through what they meant for structure and outcome. When she finished, she closed the folder and thanked him for respecting her decision. The phrase landed heavily. Respect had always been his defense. He told himself he had respected her boundaries. Only now did he see how little space those boundaries allowed her to breathe. They walked together toward the exit, side by side but not touching, the distance between them precise. At the glass doors, Lena stopped. She turned to him, her gaze steady, and said something quietly, something that was not an argument but a statement of fact. I stayed because I believed silence could be enough. It was not. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no prepared language fit the moment. All his explanations relied on rules, and rules no longer applied. Lena gave a small nod, not waiting for an answer, and pushed the door open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sound of the city, footsteps and traffic blending into a steady hum. Ethan stood just inside, watching as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the light catching her profile for a brief second before she merged with the crowd. There was no backward glance. That was when it hit him, not as panic, but as a deep, disorienting collapse. He had not lost control in an argument or a scandal. He had lost it in her calm certainty. The realization hollowed him out. Back upstairs, the paperwork remained unsigned on the table. Ethan returned to the penthouse later that night without remembering the drive. The space felt enormous, the ceilings too high, the rooms too clean. He noticed the lamp by the sofa was still off, the darkness unbroken. He sat down without turning it on, staring at the reflection of the city in the window, and felt something inside him give way. For years, he had believed discipline prevented pain. Watching Lena walk away for the final time dismantled that belief completely. The pain did not come from chaos. It came from understanding too late. He replayed her words again and again. Silence could not be enough, and recognized the truth buried inside them. He had demanded restraint when what she needed was recognition. He had drawn a line to feel safe and forced her to disappear behind it. That night, Ethan did not sleep. He remained in the dark, fully aware for the first time that the structure he trusted had failed him, and that the woman who once navigated his world so carefully had chosen herself instead, leaving him with a clarity he had never wanted but could know. Longer escape, and a question that refused to let him rest, whether he would finally step beyond the line he had drawn, or let it finish erasing what remained of him. The collapse did not arrive all at once. It seeped into Ethan's life through small failures that no metric could explain. He missed a meeting for the first time in his career, sitting in his car outside the office building without realizing he had not gone inside. His phone buzzed with reminders, alerts stacked neatly, but he stared at the screen as if it belonged to someone else. At night, sleep abandoned him entirely. He lay awake replaying moments that had once seemed insignificant. Lena standing quietly at the edge of rooms. Lena lowering her voice when he entered. Lena nodding instead of questioning. He had mistaken her calm for indifference, her restraint for a lack of need. Now those memories sharpened, cutting through his carefully managed detachment. He began to understand that she had not been silent because she had nothing to say, but because she believed being heard was not permitted. The penthouse turned hostile in its perfection. Every surface reflected his solitude. The absence of her routines disrupted his sense of order more than he expected. He found himself reaching for his phone at odd hours, stopping just before dialing, telling himself he was respecting her choice. In truth, he was afraid. Afraid that she would not answer. Afraid that if she did, he would not know how to speak without hiding behind rules. At work, his authority faltered in subtle ways. He snapped at an executive over a minor delay, then dismissed the entire team early without explanation. His assistant asked if he was unwell. Ethan replied with a single word and closed his door. He stared at the city from his office window, realizing that the view no longer steadied him. Control, once his anchor, now felt like a weight dragging him downward. Memories surfaced that he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. His mother's departure, the way she packed quietly, avoiding confrontation, leaving him standing in a hallway too young to articulate loss. His father's response, rigid and distant, drawing emotional lines that were never crossed again. Ethan had modeled his life after that example, believing discipline equaled safety. Lena's departure mirrored that early abandonment too closely for comfort, and the parallel unsettled him deeply. He recognized the pattern with sudden clarity. He had drawn lines to prevent pain, yet every line ensured it arrived anyway. One evening, he returned home to find Mrs. Hale in the living room, adjusting flowers that no longer felt necessary. He watched her for a moment before asking a question he had avoided. Did she seem happy at the end? Mrs. Hale did not hesitate. She seemed relieved. Sir, she said gently. The word struck him harder than any accusation could have. Relieved implied release, an escape from something confining. That something had been him. Ethan nodded and dismissed her, retreating into the silence he had once prized. Alone, he sat on the floor beside the sofa, jacket discarded, tie loosened, the posture unguarded. He replayed Lena's final words, silence could not be enough, and finally allowed himself to feel the truth beneath them. Love without acknowledgement was not love. It was erasure. The realization dismantled the last defenses he had maintained. For the first time, he considered what it would mean to approach someone without conditions, without guarantees. The thought terrified him. It also felt necessary. In the early hours of the morning, as the city outside slowed and the lights dimmed, Ethan made a decision that contradicted everything he had built his life around. He would no longer wait for order to restore itself. He would act without knowing the outcome. He stood, moving through the dark apartment, and for the first time since Lena left, he turned on the lamp by the sofa. The light filled the room softly, revealing nothing new, yet the gesture felt symbolic, a quiet admission that he was ready to see what he had avoided. The collapse had stripped him of certainty, but in its place grew something unfamiliar, a fragile resolve. Ethan Cross, the man who had always believed power lay in restraint, now faced the truth that restraint had cost him the only connection that mattered. And with that understanding came an urgency that could not be deferred, pushing him toward a choice that would either redefine him entirely or confirm the loss he could no longer deny, leaving the question hanging in the air of whether redemption was still possible or if realization had simply arrived too late. When Ethan finally moved, he did so without the armor that had once defined him. He did not call an assistant or arrange a meeting through intermediaries. He did not wear a tailored suit or bring prepared language. He drove himself across the city in the early afternoon, traffic thick but moving, his thoughts uncharacteristically quiet. Lena had not disappeared. She had chosen a smaller life, one measured in purpose rather than presentation. Through discreet inquiries, Ethan learned where she was working now, a nonprofit strategy firm housed in a converted brick building near the river, a place that valued function over prestige. Standing across the street, he watched people come and go, noticing how easily Lena blended into the flow, not shrinking this time, but fitting. When she emerged for lunch, he almost did not recognize her, not because she had changed dramatically, but because her posture carried a calm he had never allowed himself to see before. She walked with intention, speaking to a colleague, smiling without restraint. The sight unsettled him more than her departure ever had. He realized she was not waiting to be found. Approaching her required something he had never practiced: humility without leverage. Ethan crossed the street, the noise of the city rising around him. When Lena noticed him, she stopped mid-sentence, surprise flickering briefly before settling into composure. They stood facing each other on the sidewalk, no contracts between them, no shared obligations. Ethan spoke first, his voice steady but stripped of authority. "I am not here to ask you to come back," he said. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. He continued before fear could interrupt. "I am here because I finally understand what it cost you to stay." Lena listened without interrupting, her expression guarded but attentive. Ethan did not justify his past behavior. He did not explain the reasons behind the line or the rules. He acknowledged them. "I thought structure kept people safe," he said quietly. "I did not see how much it took from you." The admission felt like stepping off a ledge without knowing if the ground would appear. Lena responded with honesty that mirrored his own. She told him she had loved him in the only way she thought was allowed, and that leaving had not been an act of punishment, but of survival. Her voice did not shake. She was not pleading for understanding. She was stating a fact. Ethan nodded, absorbing the truth without defense. He offered nothing in return except presence. He did not ask her to forgive him. He did not promise change he could not guarantee. Instead, he made a choice that would have once felt unthinkable. He told her he had begun the process of stepping back from his role at Cross Holdings, delegating authority, dismantling the structure that had consumed him. Not for her, he clarified, but because he could no longer confuse control with safety. Lena studied him, searching for signs of manipulation, but found none. The conversation ended without resolution. She did not invite him into her new life, nor did she shut the door completely. She thanked him for coming, then turned to return to her colleagues. As she walked away, Ethan resisted the urge to follow. This time, he understood that pursuit without permission was just another form of control. Days passed. He did not contact her. Instead, he focused on undoing the systems he had built around himself, learning to sit with uncertainty rather than eradicate it. When Lena reached out weeks later, it was brief and unexpected. She asked if he wanted to walk with her along the river after work. Ethan agreed without hesitation, yet without expectation. As they walked side by side, the distance between them undefined, he sensed something fragile beginning to form, not reconciliation, but possibility. Lena stopped at one point, looking out at the water, and asked a question that carried the weight of everything left unsaid. "Can you love without rules?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at the current, steady and unforced, and realized that love, like water, could not be contained without losing its nature. "I do not know yet," he said honestly, "but I am willing to learn." Lena considered this, the silence stretching comfortably between them. She did not respond with certainty, but she did not walk away. And in that pause, that unresolved space, something shifted, offering a quiet promise that the story was not finished, only transformed, leaving both of them standing at the edge of something new, uncertain, and finally real. The weeks that followed unfolded without ceremony, which somehow made them more meaningful. Ethan and Lena did not rush to define what they were rebuilding. They met for walks along the river, conversations unfolding slowly, no contracts waiting at the end. Ethan learned to listen without planning his response, to sit with pauses rather than fill them with certainty. He spoke less about work and more about the spaces he had never examined, the fear of being left, the belief that control could substitute for connection. Lena listened without trying to fix him. She shared her own journey, how stepping away had felt terrifying and freeing at the same time, how choosing herself had restored a sense of dignity she had nearly forgotten. One evening, as autumn settled in and the city softened under amber light, Ethan invited her to see something. He did not send a driver or reserve a restaurant. He met her outside a modest brownstone in a quieter neighborhood, a place far removed from the penthouse they once shared. Inside, the space was simple, warm, intentionally imperfect. "This is where I live now," he said, not as an offering, but as a fact. Lena took in the room, noticing the absence of excess, the presence of intention. Ethan explained that he had finalized his transition away from daily control of the company, choosing a role that allowed him to contribute without disappearing into it. I needed to know who I was without the structure, he said. Lena nodded, understanding that this was not a gesture for her, but a step toward himself. They sat together, the silence comfortable, and for the first time, Ethan did not feel the urge to draw a line. He reached into a drawer and removed the original contract, edges worn from being carried too long. Without ceremony, he tore it in half, then again, placing the pieces on the table. No rules, he said quietly. No expectations. Just choice. Lena studied him, weighing the moment. She did not rush to embrace him or promise anything beyond honesty. She asked one question, the same one she had asked before. Are you choosing this even if I do not stay? Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, he said. That answer changed everything. Their relationship did not reset to something idealized. It grew deliberately, shaped by mutual consent rather than obligation. They learned each other anew, not as husband and wife bound by necessity, but as two people choosing presence over protection. Months later, standing by the river where they had first walked after his collapse, Ethan took Lena's hand without asking permission from fear. He did not propose with a ring or a rehearsed speech. He simply said that life had taught him the cost of drawing lines where bridges were needed, and that loving her had taught him the courage to remain open. Lena smiled, a quiet recognition passing between them. She agreed to stay, not because she needed him, but because she wanted to build something that did not erase either of them. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive, as it always had. Yet for Ethan Cross, the man who once believed boundaries were the key to survival, the realization settled gently and finally. True security was not found in control, but in the willingness to be seen. Love was not a contract to be managed, but a choice renewed daily. Watching Lena walk away had destroyed the version of him that hid behind rules. Choosing to walk beside her rebuilt something far stronger. And if there is one quiet lesson this story leaves behind, it is this. Kindness without recognition becomes sacrifice. Control without empathy becomes loneliness. But when courage replaces fear, and choice replaces obligation, even the coldest heart can learn how to love without lines. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a moment when letting go changed everything, please take a second to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you enjoy stories that explore love, growth, and second chances, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Your support helps us keep bringing these stories to life, and we are grateful you chose to spend this time with us.